Okay, welcome back to more blood flow videos here. Now the last anatomy video was kind of long a little bit because we were going through our first example of a blood drop tracing. This one won't be quite as long as we talk about blood flow to the head. All right, so let's say we are thinking about how a drop of oxygenated blood is going to wind up making it to the head. And we're just really going to focus on some of the bigger, more important blood vessels as we've been talking about earlier. All right, so if you're over on the right-hand side and oxygenated blood is headed up to the right side of the head, of course, that oxygenated blood travels up the aortic, ascending aorta, enters the aortic arch, takes the brachiocephalic artery over on the right-hand side. Now, when we went to the arm, our blood drop had to travel through the right subclavian artery to head over to the right arm. If we're going up to the neck and the head, we're going to head up this large artery, and that one is the common carotid artery. So that's one you need to know. That's a large artery that runs along the side of the neck. You guys have heard of that before, most likely. Now, yes, if you're looking really closely at this diagram, there are other smaller arteries that exit off of the subclavian artery and carry oxygenated blood up to some areas of the neck and the head. And one of those includes the vertebral artery that you see over here. You know, that's a fairly significant artery. That's the one that actually runs through, if you guys remember, the transverse foramina in your cervical vertebrae. You have those holes in the transverse processes, the little wings that extend off of the sides of the vertebrae. The hole was there because of those vertebral artery. The vertebral artery passes through those on each side. So that's an important artery as well, but we're not going to use that one for our blood drop traces. We're just going to assume when we're talking about the head that blood is passing through this common carotid artery. Now, if you look closely, the common carotid artery is going to split into two branches. So there's the common carotid, and that's going to split into an external carotid artery and an internal carotid artery. And if we kind of follow along, here is our external carotid artery. I'm kind of tracing that with my pen. There it is. So it's headed up the side of the head, and then it branches off, and it supplies oxygenated blood to a lot of the superficial areas of the head and the scalp. It has some other branches as well. There's one over here that you can see that heads back off in this direction towards the occipital bone around over on the backhand side of the head. So a good deal of the superficial portions of the head receive their oxygenated blood from the external carotid artery. So if I asked you to do a blood drop tracing to the scalp or a superficial portion of the head, just assume that we're using the external carotid artery to get there. It's not quite that simplistic, but that's the assumption we're going to make for just learning some of the basics about blood flow to the head. All right, the other branch on here is this one, the internal carotid artery. That's a big one, and it's headed up this way, and you can't really see it after that because it is headed inside the skull where it is going to deliver oxygenated blood to the brain. Now, there are some branches that come off of it that do deliver some blood. If you look closely at the diagram, there are branches that come off of it and deliver blood to some portions of the face. We're not going to worry about that. If I'm asking you to do a blood drop tracing using the internal carotid artery, I'm going to tell you that that blood is headed toward the brain. So just keep that in mind. So that's pretty straightforward, going to the head. And let's move on over here to the veins. Now, how does this blood get back to the heart? Okay, you also have an internal, we don't have a carotid vein. So keep that in mind. That's a little quirk compared to most of the rest of the things in the body that we're studying. You do not have a carotid vein. So it's called the jugular. And you have an internal jugular vein and you have an external jugular vein. There is no common jugular. So that's another quirky thing. With our veins as well, there is no common jugular. Okay, so let's take a look. Let me change pen colors over here for a second. Where is our internal jugular vein? This big, giant vein you see right in here is the internal jugular vein, and it really is connecting directly into the brachiocephalic vein over on that side. Internal jugular versus the brachio and the brachiocephalic. The internal jugular vein, if you look closely, yes, it is receiving the deoxygenated blood that is draining off of the brain. And if you look closely at the diagram, it's actually receiving a lot of the deoxygenated blood that's draining off of the scalp and from the face as well. So a lot of that blood, both from inside and outside, actually enters into the internal jugular vein. The external jugular vein is a smaller vein over here. And notice that it connects into the subclavian vein. And then that blood will pass through that into the brachiocephalic vein. That's going to connect into the superior vena cava, which will bring it back to the right atrium. So if you look really closely, the external jugular vein is really mainly receiving deoxygenated blood from around the occipital bone, back of the lower back portion of the head. But it's not quite that simplistic, because here's a big vein that's running along the mandible, and that one actually connects into the external jugular vein as well. All right, and we're not going to get too overly concerned about that. So if I'm telling you a blood drop is traveling to the surface of the skull, the scalp, I'm going to use the back of the head as the example. That way you'll know to use the external carotid artery to deliver the oxygenated blood to that area, and then you're going to use the external jugular vein to bring it back over here to the subclavian vein. Or I'll tell you, trace a drop of blood to the brain, and in that case you know it's traveling through the internal carotid to go inside the brain, and it's going to drain back through the internal jugular vein on its way back. And just remember that the internal jugular connects into the brachiocephalic vein, as you see there. But just keep in mind, it's not that simplistic, because if blood is draining off of the scalp or most of the face, a lot of that blood would actually also come back in through the internal jugular as well. We'll just keep things a little bit simpler than that. Okay, I wanted to bring up visible body for a minute, just to show some things to you on this 3D view. It can help you visualize some of these things. And we've got our arteries and our veins here. So, see, things look a little different when you're looking at everything together on something that's a little bit more realistic than a textbook diagram. But let's say blood traveling to the brain. I'm going to do multi-select here. I'm going to hide some of the bones here so we can see what's going on a little bit better. Strip all those off. Okay, so if oxygenated blood is going to head to the brain, it's going to get pumped out of the left ventricle. It's going to enter right in there. That's called the base of the aorta on visible body. But learn it as the ascending aorta. That's a pretty common term for you guys to learn. That then enters the aortic arch. That's this arching part of the aorta. and then it's going to come over here, and it's going to enter the brachiocephalic trunk, so you can see where that's located here on visible body. We kind of zoom in. All right, we're going up to the head, so right in there, that is the common carotid artery, highlighted in light blue for you. And if we look carefully, right in here, we can see where that common carotid artery splits. It's a little harder to see when you've got all this stuff going on, where you're seeing the nerves and the veins and the arteries all together, but right in there, that's where it's going to split. So there's your external carotid, and there's your internal carotid. But let me zoom out so you can see where those arteries are headed in a little bit more detail. There's your external carotid artery right in there, which is leading to this artery, which is called the superficial temporal artery. You don't have to know that, but that's, a lot of these arteries are just named for their regional locations. And it has other branches as well. Here's another branch of it that's carrying blood. It's called the auricular artery, that's carrying blood to other parts of the scalp. All right, then if we zoom back in, there's your internal carotid artery. Kind of follow along with that. And visible body has this faded, but right in here, that's that carotid foramen, which leads into the carotid canal that you guys learned about when you were studying the cranial bones back in Biology 201. That's the opening for the internal carotid artery. And that's leading to a portion that does this. Makes a little curve, and it's actually passing through the temporal bone inside there. It has a little canal through the bones inside there. And then it emerges. I'm just going to let me click it or not. Probably not, no, because it's clicking the bone. But it enters in there, and then it's inside the brain. It's bringing the oxygenated blood inside the brain. And then blood coming back. All right, let's look over here at the neck. There's your internal jugular. So that's the big vein, and that's leading to the brachiocephalic vein, which leads to the superior vena cava, like you see on there. And if we highlight again that internal jugular vein in light blue, you can see how far upward that vein extends, and it has lots of branches coming off of it. So for example, blood that's passing through this superficial temporal vein, that leads to this vein, which connects to this one, which connects to this one, which is going to bring finally that blood into the internal jugular. So you've got lots of minor veins that all connect together, one-way street, one-way blood flow, and a lot of those are going to dump into that internal jugular vein. The external jugular vein is over here. And if you look carefully, where is it receiving blood from? It's receiving blood from this vein right in here, which is called the occipital vein, because if you wrap our model around, you can see that it extends along that right-hand side of the occipital bone. Now, if you look right in there, there's a little vein that's actually connecting to this one, and that veins do, in the cases of veins, you guys are learning over on the physiology side that there are anastomoses, there are alternative routes. So in some cases, a blood drop might be going this way and eventually head into the internal jugular vein over here, or that blood drop might take this side street over here and wind up entering into the external jugular vein. Okay, so it's not always, because of these anastomoses, these alternative routes that we have, it's not always cut and dry when you're thinking about blood coming back from the superficial parts of the head, whether that blood is actually going to enter into the external or the internal jugular veins. Just keep that in mind. But again, the example I'll use for you guys on blood drop tracing, if I want you to use the external jugular vein, I'm going to refer to the occipital part of the head, because that blood, its only way back is to come down here into the external jugular. And for internal jugular, just to keep things clean and simple, all the blood that's deoxygenated blood that's draining off of the brain winds up entering that internal jugular vein. So I'll use that as your example in those cases. All right, let's come back over here. Let's do a practice. Trace a drop of blood from the right atrium to the left side of the brain and back. Now, everything we've been looking at there in the video dealt with the right side of the brain. Let's talk about the left side of the brain. All right, I'm not going to go back through the entire pulmonary circuit because we did that on the last example activity. But keep practicing with that so that you know that pulmonary circuit. So we started in the right atrium, so we have to go through that whole pulmonary circuit before we can wind up in the ascending aorta and now our aortic arch. We're going over to the left side. There is no left brachiocephalic artery. Keep that in mind. So we're going to exit into the left common carotid artery. That's going to enter the left internal carotid artery. That's going to bring the oxygenated blood into the brain. Yes, there are smaller arteries in the brain that will go to specific locations. We're not going to learn those. Just assume that you then enter brain arterioles, capillaries, and venules like you would in any other tissue, and then assume that that deoxygenated blood has passed through the smaller veins that it needs to get into the left internal jugular vein. That connects into the left brachiocephalic vein. Do specify left and right with the brachiocephalic veins because you do have a left and a right in those cases. Superior vena cava, you only have one of those. And now we're back into the right atrium. So that's all there is to it with the head. Not too hard. One thing I do want to caution you about with the blood drop tracings, don't try to memorize every possible blood drop tracing. You really need to understand how all of these arteries and veins are interconnected so that you're not relying on just trying to use basic memorization to try to learn these blood drop traces. There's no way that you can anticipate every single possible blood drop trace you might receive on an exam. You need to understand where these arteries go and which veins are there to bring the blood back toward the heart. Okay, the next anatomy video we're going to be covering blood flow to the abdominopelvic organs, and this one will be a longer video clip because we do have some quirks with the different arteries and veins that serve that part of the body. So that will be a little bit more of an extensive activity for us to go through.